During World War II, there were many brutal and ruthless concentration camp guards who were, for their crimes, later brought to trial. Different guards were known for their evil actions inside sites such as Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz and Dachau. But there were many more guards who escaped any form of punishment despite their reputation. Inside the execution chamber of Hamelin Prison, British executioner Albert Pierrepoint brought the lives of many Nazis to an end. And one man who went plunging through Pierrepoint's gallows was Adolf Speck, a man who was known for his bestial crimes inside of Neuengamme concentration camp. He was a man who oversaw groups of prisoners and was good friends with the commandant of the site, but Adolf Speck was later sentenced to death for the fact he shot and took the lives of prisoners, and he was known for his violence. But what happened with his execution inside of Hamelin Prison's execution chamber? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Adolf Speck was born in 1911, and he, like millions of people inside of Germany, was attracted to the politics of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. The Nazis, following the failings of the Weimar Republic, promised to provide people with food and work, and Adolf Hitler quickly gained a huge following, and he managed to manipulate his way into power. Many of the most virulent Nazis would later take jobs inside of concentration camps, and they devoted their time to the Nazi cause, keeping political prisoners and those who were being persecuted locked up inside of sites such as Dachau, which was the first Nazi concentration camp which opened. Adolf Speck worked in Kiel, and he then later trained with a police battalion to become a police officer. However, as the Second World War broke out, he was deployed to the Eastern Front following the launching of Operation Barbarossa. It's not known specifically what he did inside of the armed forces, whether he was on the front lines or whether he was involved in rounding up civilians for execution in his police role, or he may have just been a police officer who worked under occupation inside the foreign lands. He would also later be sent to the Netherlands. But in 1943, Speck was sent to Neuengamme concentration camp, where he worked as a guard. He arrived in the summer of that year, and then worked as the commander of the brickworks, overseeing a number of prisoners who were working in the facility. He was known for being a violent brute who would whip and beat inmates who he believed were not working hard enough. Neuengamme as a concentration camp was huge, and over 100,000 political prisoners passed through the main camp and its subcamps. It's believed around 43,000 people were slaughtered inside of the camp, and many at the end of the war died in the death marches. The camp deployed an extreme extermination through labour policy, and hunger at the site killed most of the inmates. The prisoners' food was so poor and insufficient that, coupled with the brutal work they were forced to do, the life expectancy of inmates was roughly just 3 months from when they first entered the camp. Prisoners also contracted dysentery, and this killed many, and some tried their best to obtain whatever scraps of food and hydration that they could get. Life at the site was a constant battle to survive, and prisoners slept on the floor of overcrowded wooden barracks. Sleep was also impossible in these rooms, and the prisoners were forced to work 10 to 12-hour days. The working conditions and the violence of guards such as Adolf Speck led to thousands of deaths, and the SS guards also utilised brutal punishments. Many prisoners at Neuengamme were killed by lethal injection if they could not work hard enough, and a crematoria in April 1942 was constructed at the camp, as previously all of the bodies of the deceased were sent to Hamburg for cremation, which the Nazis later deemed as being too costly. As mentioned, Adolf Speck was good friends with the Neuengamme camp commandant Max Pauli, and through this relationship he received SS promotion and promotion inside of the camp. But one horrific crime that Speck was involved in was committed inside of the Bullenhauser Damm school in Hamburg. It was here where 20 children and their carers were executed and killed in terrible ways. Neuengamme opened up a subcamp in the school to house prisoners, and this was later evacuated. But on the night of April the 20th, 1945, 20 Jewish children who had been used in sadistic human medical experimentation at Neuengamme were injected with morphine, and they were then hanged from the walls of the basement of the school. Their carers, shall we say, were also subjected to this treatment, 4 adults and 6 Soviet prisoners who were all executed in this manner as well. Later, 24 other Soviet prisoners were brought to the school and they were murdered. This incident became known as the Bullenhuser Dam massacre. Adolf Speck was one of 3 SS guards as well as a driver who accompanied SS doctors to carry out the killings. It was later stated of the crime that the children sat down on the benches all around and were cheerful and happy that they had for once been allowed out of Neuengamme. The children were completely unsuspecting. After being injected, the victims were hanged from hooks, and some of the guards even used their own weight to tighten the noose around the necks, pulling down on the bodies. It was later stated at his trial about his conduct inside of Neuengamme that, and I quote, "Speck has brought the curse of all the prisoners upon himself. When a hungry inmate sneaks through the camp and steals a turnip somewhere to fill himself up, Speck reaches for it. The inmate has to bend down and is hit until he collapses. Then he gets kicked on top of that. Speck is not always sure whether he is allowed to act like that, but he feels like an absolute lord, a master, and thus remains nothing more than a beast in human form, despised and silently lurking around all the prisoners. But unfortunately, we are defenceless against this devil from hell. He has deaths on his conscience, and yet has no conscience. We prisoners remember our tormentors well. At the rear exit of the camp, Speck is in his territory. Here he controls every inmate like a lynx. Nothing escapes him. At his guard booth, he beats up the prisoners. The camp leader or commander never knew anything about his actions. Speck does not report punishment. He punishes himself. And the punishment is usually more severe. In the evenings when he is on duty, he runs around the block like a madman, looking for victims. He has to hit people. It is in his blood. He is not satisfied if a day goes by without being hit. The most cowardly thing about him is that he does not choose big, strong people, but always the Musulmaner, the weak ones. He is certainly afraid of the strong ones, who are already few and far between. Another former prisoner of the camp claimed about his crimes that Thurman's second assistant, Speck, was the chief executioner in the camp. Very few prisoners escaped his torture. The professional sadistic executioner delighted in the suffering of his victims. If someone he was tormenting did not scream or beg for mercy, Speck could beat him to death. Even if he had no guilty person in front of him, which rarely happened, the perverse sadist subjected the first person he saw to torture, whether because he had not been respectful enough or because he had not pulled his cap off quickly enough when he passed Speck. At the end of the Second World War, Adolf Speck accompanied a transport of roughly 250 prisoners to Flensburg, and he claimed he was just a policeman, and he then handed himself over to the authorities. In the Curio House trial, the courtroom heard about his crimes, and for this he was sentenced to death. It was inside of Hamelin Prison's execution chamber that Adolf Speck's life was brought to an end. Experienced British executioner Albert Pierrepoint was a man who took his life. On the day of his execution, the 6th of October 1946, Speck was transferred to the condemned cell in the prison's west wing, and these cells held the condemned for a matter of hours. Previously, Pierrepoint had met with Speck and the others and calculated their height and weight, and then the drop needed to bring their lives to a quick end. Pierrepoint executed the men in pairs, so Adolf Speck, along with another condemned man, would have been brought out of the small condemned cells, had their arms secured behind their backs, and he was then led into the execution chamber. The gallows here had enough space to hang 2 at once, and Speck was then taken up the steps and led onto a small chalk mark on the floor. A black or white hood was then placed over his head, and the noose was secured by Pierrepoint. After the 2 men were stood in position, with the nooses secured, Pierrepoint released the trapdoor, and Speck plunged to his death through the gallows. Adolf Speck was a brutal and ruthless man who tortured and beat prisoners inside of Neuengamme on a daily basis. He was someone who was known for his evil. But he was, at the end of the Second World War, condemned for his role inside of the concentration camps, but also for his involvement in the terrible crimes that took place inside of the school. He is remembered alongside other concentration camp guards for his crimes, and he was one of many who were hanged by Albert Pierrepoint inside of Hamelin Prison. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.